Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you left a like on this video and subscribe to my channel to see future content like that. And today I am going to be doing an individual album review, this time of the band Memphis May Fire and their newest album entitled Remade In Misery. Memphis May Fire is a metalcore band that I have had a, let's just say, interesting history with, and I think that would be an understatement. I am a huge fan of their album, The Hollow. I would actually say it's one of the most influential albums to me when I was a teenager. It was one of those albums that really got me into metalcore along with a couple of other bands. I think that album still holds up magnificently. I still return to it very often. I think it's nearly perfect. I love the concepts of it. Unfortunately, because Memphis May Fire made such a huge impact with their second album, they really had a high order to try to match up to it in the future, and I feel like they never really got close. Honestly, I know a lot of people like Challenger, their third album, and I don't dislike the album, not by any means. In fact, I do like it as well, but I do think it was quite a big step down from The Hollow. I think the lyrical content on it was more generic, and I honestly think that lyrically some of the songs don't hold up as well as they could, especially something like Jezebel, which is a bit of a yikes song now that you look at the lyrics. And then Unconditional came out, and once again, I had very similar feelings to it as I did Challenger. I do like the album a little better than Challenger, and I do revisit it more often than that album, but it did have the problem of showing that the band was getting a little preachy with their lyrics. Now, as a Christian myself, I am not against Christian lyrics, but I think the way that Maddie Mullins, the lead singer of Memphis May Fire, was writing them often felt like a very hackneyed sermon to me more than anything else. But then after that, sadly, the band fell off really hard. They leaned even harder into those hackneyed lyrics and the feeling of a overdone sermon, which felt very cheesy. And they made what is, in my opinion, their worst album, which is This Light in Me. I really could not stand this album. I think it's one of the worst metalcore albums I have ever heard. After that, they pretty much ditched their metalcore sound entirely after that, which wasn't really surprising to me because I already felt they were going pretty generic on the previous album. And then they come out with Broken, which is pretty much a very generic rock album with some metalcore aspects to it, but not very much. And fans hated this one across the board for the most part. I didn't see many people enjoying this one. The lead single was probably the best song on the album, which is bad because the lead single was already way below anything that the band had released previously. Eventually, in 2021, they released a new song called Blood and Water, and I was very hesitant going into the song. I still check out this band, even if they have disappointed me or been mostly mediocre for the rest of their career after The Hollow. I still went and checked out this song because I've always known that they had it in them. There had to be something in them that could bring back the quality of that second album. And Blood and Water, man, that song just delivered. It brought the biggest smile to my face. It saw the band back in form. Probably the best they had ever sounded, in fact, definitely the best they had ever sounded since Unconditional, and probably, honestly, the best they've sounded, period, since The Hollow, in my opinion. So, I was very excited to check out what the rest of this album had to offer. The only other song I checked out was The American Dream, and I was admittedly a little worried about this album because of its disastrous release strategy. The band decided to release 9 of the 11 songs before the album came out, which I think is a bad release strategy. But with all that being said, how did Remade In Misery fare overall? All I can say is that, man, it is good to have Memphis May Fire back in better form than they have been in years. In fact, exactly a decade, I would say. I could compare this almost to the Wage War redemption story in terms of coming off of an album that was generic to bad and bringing back the sound that they've been known and loved for, like Wage War coming off Pressure and then releasing Manic, which was a much better version of that album. And I honestly think that Remade In Misery is a better version of Broken. It has a lot of the same themes of that previous album, talking about finding redemption in the midst of hard times and targeting toxic people in Maddie's life and talking about the struggles that he goes through in personal detail, except this album actually does that in a way that is compelling and interesting, as opposed to Broken's very uninteresting and generic way of doing it. And the Wage War comparison can even be drawn further because Corey, the clean vocalist of Wage War, was heavily involved in the writing of some of these songs. In fact, he was involved in the writing of pretty much all of them. And this album gets off to a very strong start in its first half. It starts off with Blood and Water, which I think is just still an electric lead single. I think it's one of the best off the album still, and I think it has some of the best writing on the album as well, talking about an abusive relationship with huge weight, and the chorus just explodes off the page. It feels like instant iconic Memphis May Fire. This is one that's going to be in rotation for them for years to come, I feel like, because it has that feeling that is integral to their identity. And then you get the more rock version of Memphis May Fire, which they had shown on Broken, and once again, like Wage War, interestingly enough, they actually do rock better here because it feels actually more energetic. And I think it helps that this song has a chorus that feels like it just really soars. It has this sort of epic weight to it, and once again the lyrics feel like they're actually having something important to say. And then Somebody comes along and is more of a ballad in some ways, although it still has some definite rock elements to it. And I like how this song is talking about losing your sense of self and your identity in the midst of tough times, in the midst of personal struggle. Death Inside is an immediate banger and shows some nu metal influence that this album actually has in a couple of other places too. Matty Mullins actually tries his hand at sort of scream rapping here, and it actually works to his benefit more often than not. It's actually an interesting variation on his screams. His way of scream rapping almost reminds me of something out of Let Live's playbook, although not as great as them, obviously, but still something that at least brings some variation to Memphis May Fire's sound that they haven't really shown before. This one in particular just really blew me away, and is one that I was singing along to almost as soon as I heard it, honestly. It's just so fun. And the same goes for The American Dream, which is by far my favorite song on the album. I think it has the most substance besides Blood and Water in terms of its lyrical content. This one goes for a more political bent, and while this subject has been done before, the idea that we attack people on the other side of the political spectrum and we don't really look for ways to try and actually engage with one another and actually try to understand one another, I think this band does a good variation on it that works. And oh man, this chorus is one of Memphis May Fire's best. I really do think that. It hooks your claws. It hooks its claws in you, and it does not let go. I absolutely love this one, and it's probably going to be one of my favorite songs of the year. The title track, Misery, actually earns its place as a legitimately great title track, as this is another one that I would consider a top tier on the album, and I think it sort of solidifies the themes of the album together really well. This idea that we can find redemption in the times where we are at our lowest, and that we can be remade and reborn in those times. And obviously they're sort of highlighting their Christian beliefs here as well, sort of this idea of rebirth and resurrection through faith. But unlike their previous albums as a whole, and especially in this song, I think the band is actually finally not delivering their lyrics like it's a over-the-top sermon or something that feels like it's just meant to be so on the nose. I think Maddie's vocals are more passionate here. It feels like he is putting even some grit on his vocals here that he doesn't usually have. It's almost like he sings screaming in the chorus, and he even goes a little bit into his lower vocal register, which he doesn't do that often, making this a pretty unique song in Memphis May Fire's catalog, and once again, a pretty big highlight. And I think the album ends off on a pretty positive note with Only Human and The Fight Within. Only Human provides some fun variation in the album where they have a featured vocalist, AJ Chanter of Fire from the Gods, and I think his vocals really blend well, and I think he shows some real energy in his vocals. And then the album ends on another ballad, this one called The Fight Within, and I actually think this is one of Memphis May Fire's best ballads, if not their best ballad, period. If I'm being honest, I've never really been a big fan of Memphis May Fire's ballads. On both Unconditional and Challenger, they were not that good, and their follow-up albums, of course, they were even worse in my opinion. They ranged from mediocre to straight up just really cringe, especially when they were songs about Maddie's relationships. I felt like they were very cheesy and just hurt to listen to sometimes, honestly. But this one just, it feels like the band is really confident here. And once again, it's because the lyrics are saying something beyond the surface level. I think there's something deeper going on here. And I think the dynamics of the song really help it as well. It goes very soft at first. It even has some vocoded vocals in there, which I really like. And it has some sort of pop elements that I think actually work to the song's benefit. But then the song sort of explodes and has a sort of climax that it really needs. And I think when that happened, I was really sold on the song and it really worked for me. So it ends up being a very strong way to end the album, and I think it reinforces the themes of the album well. And after some songs that can be a little dark in places, I think this one is sort of like the ending track on The Hollow, where it provides that redemption and that sort of levity that the album needed. Now, there are definitely some problems to this album. It's not perfect, and there are still some places where you can see some cliched elements coming in. I will say that this is most apparent in what is probably my least favorite album on the album, which is Your Turn. Now, I did mention in the beginning part of my review that I thought that the wage war influences on this album were pretty big, especially with Corey writing it, and Your Turn is probably the most egregious example of this on the album, period. It honestly feels like a retread of Relapse from Manic to me. I also think that Make Believe is not super intriguing and is an example of another mediocre Memphis May Fire ballad. Overall, they do their ballads better on this album, as Somebody and The Fight Within show, but Make Believe just didn't work for me as well as those. And honestly, I think it was the sort of weird incorporation of overproduced synths that killed the song for me more than anything else. I just didn't care for it that much in that regard. And Left for Dead, while fun, just didn't leave much of an impression on me, and sort of felt like a retread of Blood and Water, just not as interesting. But it wasn't a bad song necessarily, it's just not one that I see myself returning to as much as some of the other great songs on here. So overall, honestly, this was just such a return to form. My optimism for this band ever going back to their metalcore roots, especially the strongest ones they boasted on their first two albums, and especially The Hollow, had been waning steadily. I really felt like maybe that was just long gone for them and that Maddie didn't want to do that anymore. I'm glad that he and the band are able to have fun again with writing their music and with creating the great instrumentation. It's just so obvious here. The band feels so tight and together, and it also just feels like everyone's having fun. You can feel the passion and the way the guitar riffs are played and the excellent drumming, and especially in Maddie's vocals, which sound more rejuvenated than ever. There are some songs on here where he delivers the vocal performance of his life, especially on songs like The American Dream and Death Inside. I really do think he delivers some really good vocals on here. So with all that being said, it is good to have Memphis May Fire back. This is a redemption story that I am happy to say I was on board for, and this will have a good chance of being one of my favorite albums of the year. I really enjoyed this. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for me. So yeah, that was my review of Memphis May Fire's newest album. What were your thoughts on Remade In Misery? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece on this channel. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave this video a like and subscribe to see future content. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.